Hello Goblins, Ghouls, and Ghosts. I'm Jessie Quinn from Cup of Books, and today we're talking about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and its many film adaptations. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving was first published in a collection of short stories called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman, in 1820. It tells the story of schoolmaster Ichabod Crane and his attempts to woo Katrina Van Tassel, one of the most beautiful women in town. Oh, and also his run-in with the headless Hessian horseman that supposedly haunts Sleepy Hollow. This short story has been adapted into a long list of film versions. I finally decided it was about time to read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and finally discover why. Why does everyone want to adapt this story into film? I've heard some people say they read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow every Halloween, and now having read it, I can somewhat understand why. Irving's short story has its charming moments. There are some genuinely funny lines, and while the descriptions of the scenery are overly saturated with adjectives, they still paint very wonderful pictures. But the prose is incredibly dense and unnecessarily verbose at times. While I felt this was intentional on the author's part, with almost no dialogue, it makes the short story feel a lot longer than it should. Also, there's some negative portrayals of the black people living in Sleepy Hollow, which does this story no favors. And given that the story itself suggests that the well-known chase scene between Ichabod Crane and the headless Hessian horseman may not have been a supernatural encounter, I don't particularly feel the need to reread this one. Now I can feel elitist while I watch the television series on Fox. But The Legend of Sleepy Hollow just didn't impress me as a ghost story. But part of me is impressed that this has been adapted as many times as it has. Is it really just the image of a headless horseman chasing down the town oddball that makes so many people want to adapt this story? Or is there something more to it? Well, let's take a look at some of the more memorable film adaptations of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. One of the better known adaptations is the one I grew up with as a kid, which is Disney's animated short feature, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This short film was originally released as part of a longer feature called The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad in 1949. Legendary Bing Crosby does the narration and almost all the voices of the speaking characters in this one. There's some mostly unmemorable musical numbers, but given that it's a short Disney feature, that's pretty much expected, though it is disappointing that they didn't give Bing Crosby better lyrics. Minus the musical numbers, the adaptation itself is incredibly faithful to the original story. A lot of the lines in this film are directly lifted from the source material, and they're the good lines, so it works really well. Though the love triangle between Ichabod Crane, Brom Bones, and Katrina Van Tassel, while faithful to the story, is exaggerated in ways that makes it incredibly more annoying. But the only significant changes to the original story have to do with the Headless Horseman himself. Whereas the chase scene in the original story was maybe 2 or 3 pages long, in the film adaptation, it is an extended sequence. The animators found a good balance between some light-hearted shenanigans and some genuinely frightening moments for children. I mean, the horseman's laugh alone is guaranteed to scare at least one kid in the audience. Also, the ending somewhat differs from the original story in that it plays up the supernatural elements and doesn't really offer many rational alternatives to what could have happened. I mean, it offers one, but very half-heartedly. Honestly, those two changes are the reason why I remember this film years later, and maybe it's just me being nostalgic, but I actually feel that Disney's animated adaptation improves upon the original story, at least when it comes to the supernatural elements. The love triangle, not so much. Another popular film adaptation of this one is Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, released in 1999. The film reimagines the original plot as a murder mystery with Ichabod Crane, played by Johnny Depp, as our detective. In the film, Ichabod is not a superstitious schoolmaster. Oh no, he is a man of science and law. He is a constable from New York who gets sent to Sleepy Hollow in order to investigate a series of mysterious beheadings happening in the town. While Brown Bones is still a supporting character, the love triangle is mostly cut out, and I am so okay with that decision. There's still the romance subplot as Ichabod Crane and Katrina Van Tassel make googly eyes at each other and whisper incredibly cheesy lines, but it's a subplot. It does take the best element of the original story, the Headless Horseman, and makes that the driving force of its reimagining. I like the premise of this adaptation, but it is a overly convoluted mystery with some poorly delivered exposition. I don't find Sleepy Hollow to be a particularly good film, but it is incredibly entertaining at times. It expands on the legend of the ghostly apparition in predictable ways, but enjoyable ones. And once again, I think the Headless Horseman in this is the most memorable thing about the movie. Are you sensing a trend here? And finally, I want to talk about the most recent adaptation of this short story, the 2013 TV series Sleepy Hollow. The premise involves Revolutionary War soldier Ichabod Crane waking up in present-day Sleepy Hollow and teaming up with policewoman Abby Mills to kick some demonic ass during the oncoming biblical apocalypse a la the Book of Revelations. The end of the world scenario, of course, is heralded by our Headless Horseman, in this version reimagined as the embodiment of death itself. Loose adaptation doesn't begin to cover this one. I'm gonna level with you, the premise of this show is utterly ridiculous, and a lot of the nods towards the original story are incredibly heavy-handed. Captain Irving, anyone. But I can't help but admire the screenwriter's audacity in reimagining the legend of Sleepy Hollow as a biblical apocalyptic story. Like, that takes guts. The dialogue's witty, the characters are fun, and the action, while it's TV, is pretty entertaining. While the iconic Headless Horseman is still central to the plot, it is really much more of Ichabod's story. Okay, actually it's more Abby's story than anyone else, but Ichabod plays a much larger role than the Headless Horseman. But at the same time, I don't feel it could have been considered an adaptation of the story, even though it features Ichabod Crane and takes place in Sleepy Hollow, without the Headless Hessian Horseman. While the original story offers us rational explanations of what could have occurred to Ichabod, it is the supernatural elements of the story that people remember, and those are the aspects of the original story that get translated into the adaptation. After all, film is a visual medium, and you've got to admit that a headless Hessian horseman touting a jack-o'-lantern as its head makes for a pretty great visual.